The sun was sinking low over the wide Wyoming prairie, turning the horizon into a smear of burning gold. It should have been a peaceful sight, one Rebecca Hawley normally loved, but tonight it only sharpened the terror in her chest. Her wrists burned where the coarse rope bit into her skin, binding her to an old, half-rotted fence post that leaned like a dying man. Every breath came thin and ragged as dust swirled around her ankles. Her in-laws' horses were still visible in the distance, silhouettes growing smaller against the sunlit haze. She could still hear her mother-in-law's last words to her, spat like poison across Rebecca's face. "You brought bad luck to this family. We're done with you." They had taken everything, her tiny trunk of belongings, her wedding ring, even her boots. All they'd left behind was a scrap of fear and a life they no longer cared to claim. Rebecca's story had once been simple. She had married young and eager, hoping for a gentler life after losing her parents. Her husband Thomas had been kind, quiet, hard-working, someone who laughed softly and smelled faintly of pine. But fever had taken him fast last winter. He died with her hand in his, whispering an apology she never understood. His parents never forgave her. She had cooked, cleaned, hauled water, mended fences, and risen before dawn every morning trying to prove her worth. But the Hawley family wasn't looking for a daughter. They were looking for someone to blame. Every sick calf, every lost coin, every storm that flattened the wheat, they pinned all of it on Rebecca. And now they had cast her out in the cruelest way the frontier could imagine. A cold Wyoming wind swept across the plains, tugging at the loose strands of her hair and chilling the sweat on her skin. Somewhere behind her, a coyote yelped. She flinched, twisting her wrists against the rope, but it only tightened, sending a jolt of pain up her arms. She swallowed hard and tried to breathe. Someone will come, she told herself. A rider, a rancher, a stranger, anyone. But she knew the truth. Out here, miles from the nearest town, the world stretched wide and empty. People didn't wander these parts unless they had a reason. Hours passed. The sun sank completely. Shadows lengthened. Hunger gnawed at her belly. Fear sharp and cold settled like a stone in her throat. She wanted to cry, but she was too dry inside, too stunned by the betrayal that still wrapped around her like the ropes. She leaned her head against the rough fence post and closed her eyes. Then she heard it HOOFBEATS slow, steady, unhurried, like someone who had no fear of this wide land. Her eyes snapped open. Dust rose in the distance, stirred by a single rider. She squinted, trying to make out the figure. When the rider came closer, her heart lurched. He wasn't a settler. He rode with straight-backed confidence, wearing buckskin and beadwork that shimmered faintly even in the dimming dusk. His long black hair fell loose over his shoulders, and a small string of feathers swung from his horse's bridle. An Apache. Rebecca felt her breath seize. Not out of fear, though settlers often told frightening stories, but because he looked like someone carved out of the very land itself, steady as a cliff, dangerous as a storm, and impossibly calm. The horse slowed. The rider dismounted without a word. He approached her with quiet steps, eyes sharp but unreadable. Rebecca tried to speak, but her voice tangled in her throat. He looked at the ropes first, then at her bruised wrists, then into her eyes, holding them with a quiet intensity that made time feel heavy. Finally, his deep voice cut through the silence. "Someone did this to you." It wasn't a question. Rebecca swallowed, nodding shakily. "My in-laws." He lifted his chin slightly, as if he had expected no better answer. For a moment, the prairie was still, the wind holding its breath, the world waiting. Then he reached for his knife. Rebecca stiffened, but the blade didn't turn toward her. It slid through the rope like it was butter, freeing her hands. Her knees buckled, and he caught her with surprising gentleness. Steadying her with a strong arm, he offered her his canteen. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. He lifted her onto his horse as though she weighed nothing. Then he swung into the saddle behind her, guiding the horse away from the fence where she had been abandoned. She dared to whisper, "Why? Why are you helping me?" His voice was low, resolute, leaving no room for doubt. "Because you are not staying there. You go with me." And for the first time all day, Rebecca believed she might survive. Dakota guided his horse along a narrow trail cutting through the quiet prairie, where dusk had deepened into a purple-blue blanket across the sky. Rebecca clung weakly to the saddle horn, her body trembling from cold, shock, and exhaustion. But the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her brought an unfamiliar feeling safety. The Apache warrior rode behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against her back. He kept one arm lightly around her waist to steady her, but there was nothing possessive or frightening in his touch. It was simply practical, protective, necessary. Rebecca had heard countless stories from the settlers' stories meant to stoke fear. Tales of raids, danger, warriors who showed no mercy. But Dakota had shown her something else entirely: calm, decisive kindness. The horse stepped through a shallow creek, water splashing over its hooves. Rebecca's voice finally rose, quiet and hoarse. "Where? Where are we going?" Dakota didn't answer right away. He seemed to be listening to the wind, the land, the shift of the horse's stride. Finally he said, "First we go to water. You need rest. You need food." She swallowed. "And after? We see what you choose." Rebecca blinked. Even tied to a fence, abandoned by everyone she had trusted, she still wasn't used to being treated like her choices mattered. The trail eventually widened into a small clearing, ringed by juniper trees and lit faintly by a rising slice of moon. A narrow stream trickled nearby, and Dakota guided the horse to a stop. He dismounted smoothly, then reached up and helped her down, holding her steady until her feet remembered how to stand. When he stepped back, giving her space, she felt an unexpected chill. Not from fear, no, something different. Something she hadn't felt in months. Relief. Dakota knelt by the stream, filling his canteen. "Sit," he urged gently, nodding toward a flat stone. "Your legs will shake for a time." Rebecca obeyed, not because he commanded her, but because her body was too grateful to argue. The cool night air brushed over her skin, a welcome contrast to the heat of the day. Her wrists were raw and red, and she tried to hide them in her lap, embarrassed. But Dakota saw. Without speaking, he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small pouch. He moved with a natural quietness that made every gesture seem meaningful. He opened the pouch and poured out a soft mixture of crushed leaves and herbs. Rebecca stiffened. "What is that?" "Medicine," he said. "For pain. For swelling." His tone was calm, almost patient. She hesitated. Settlers used their own remedies, but they rarely trusted native medicines. Yet Dakota hadn't harmed her. He hadn't even raised his voice. He held out his hand, waiting. After a moment, she offered her wrist. His fingers brushed her skin warm, steady, gentle. He applied the paste with a feather-light touch, wrapping her wrist afterward with a strip of clean cloth. Rebecca's breath shook. No one had treated her wounds with such care since her husband passed. "You are used to being hurt," he observed softly, not accusing, not pitying, simply naming the truth. Rebecca looked away, eyes stinging. "My in-laws, they didn't want me after Thomas died. Everything went wrong, and they said it was my fault." Dakota tied the cloth securely. "Grief makes fools of some people. Cruel ones, too." His words struck something deep inside her. She had spent months believing maybe the Hales were right, that she was the problem. But Dakota spoke with such certainty that her chest tightened. He prepared a small fire, efficient and experienced. Once flames flickered to life, he handed her a strip of dried meat. Rebecca hesitated only a second before eating. The food was simple, but to her it tasted like safety. "Why were you out here?" she asked finally. "Riding alone, I mean." Dakota sat across the fire, its glow painting warm light across his strong features. "I scout. Watch the land. Make sure my people are safe." A pause. "Sometimes I find people who need help." She let the word settle. "You didn't have to help me." He looked at her then fully, deeply, as though measuring her strength and her sorrow in the same breath. "Leaving you there would make me less than a man," he said. "My people teach that the land tests us. Tonight, the test was yours and mine." Rebecca's throat tightened. No one had spoken of her struggle that way before, as though her survival mattered, not just to her. But to someone else. She wrapped Dakota's blanket tighter around her shoulders and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded once, like a warrior accepting a solemn vow. Then, softly, he said, "Rest now. Tomorrow, we face those who wronged you." Rebecca's breath caught. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since her husband's death, she wasn't afraid of facing it. The fire crackled, throwing golden light across the small clearing. Shadows danced on Rebecca's face as she sat beside Dakota, her knees drawn close, still shaking from the adrenaline of the day. The prairie around them stretched silent and vast, only the faint rustle of wind in the grass reminding them that they were not completely alone. Rebecca's hands were wrapped in strips of cloth, her wrists still tender, but for the first time, she could rest without fear of the rope snapping again. She had been left to die once. She would not let herself be caught off guard again. Yet, as she stared into the flames, a storm of emotions threatened to overwhelm her. Anger at her in-laws, grief for her late husband, fear for her uncertain future, and something new curiosity about the man beside her. Dakota watched her in silence, letting her speak when she was ready. His presence was steady, like the slow, unshakable beat of a drum in the heart of the prairie. I don't even know why they hate me so much," Rebecca said finally, her voice small. "I did everything they asked. I worked myself to exhaustion. I thought they'd at least care after Thomas died." Dakota nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the firelight. People often mistake grief for blame. Some try to ease their pain by hurting others. It is not your fault, and their cruelty is their own. Rebecca swallowed. His words were unlike any she had heard before. Most people, the neighbors, even the sheriff in town, would have doubted her story, whispered that she was imagining things, or worse, told her to return to her in-laws' house. Yet Dakota did not question her truth. He simply acknowledged it. "I've spent months," she continued, her voice quivering, "thinking maybe they were right. Maybe I was. Weak, unlucky, cursed somehow. But then," she hesitated, glancing at him, "then you came." He did not smile, but there was a gentleness in his expression that warmed her like the fire. "I do not judge by the fears of others. I judge by what I see." Rebecca felt a lump rise in her throat. She had been invisible for so long, reduced to rumors and accusations. Yet here, by this fire, she was seen. Truly seen. Takode leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "You have survived a great trial tonight. Many would not endure what you have endured. That is strength." "Strength," she whispered, testing the word. "I feel fragile." "Fragile does not mean weak," he said firmly. "Even the strongest tree bends in the wind. The earth itself shifts and recovers. Survivors are not those who never break, they are those who rise after breaking." The words resonated deeply. Rebecca thought of the rope biting her wrists, of the cruel sneers of her in-laws, of the nights spent alone after Thomas's death. She realized she had endured more than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. And now, sitting here with Dakota, she understood that survival was not just about avoiding harm, it was about claiming life. Even after it had been taken from her Dot, they ate in silence for a while, the fire's warmth filling the gap between them. Dakota handed her a small cup of water, and she accepted it, savoring the simple kindness. She noticed how his eyes seemed to scan the horizon constantly, not with suspicion but with awareness, teaching her through action that respect for the land and for life was survival. "You understand injustice," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "That is good. Many people walk blind, accepting cruelty as law. You must not." Rebecca met his gaze. How do you know when to fight and when to let go?" He paused, considering. "The land teaches patience. The fire teaches timing. The wind teaches caution. And the heart teaches courage." She pondered that, letting the lesson sink in. She realized that Dakota was not just saving her tonight, he was showing her how to survive in the harshness of the frontier, how to live with purpose and awareness, how to face cruelty without letting it define her. For the first time in months, Rebecca felt hope. She wasn't completely safe, not yet, but she was learning. Learning not just to survive, but to claim her own life. And she knew, deep down, that whatever challenges came next, she would not face them alone. Dakota studied her quietly, then nodded as if approving a silent decision she hadn't yet voiced. Tomorrow they would confront the in-laws. But tonight, here by the fire, Rebecca discovered the first spark of power she had lost, the power to speak, the power to act, and the power to choose her own destiny. For the first time in a long while, she believed she could endure and perhaps even thrive in the vast, untamed frontier. The first light of dawn painted the prairie in soft golds and pinks, spilling over rolling hills and the jagged outlines of distant cliffs. Rebecca's stomach tightened with nerves as Dakota guided their horses along the familiar trail toward the Holly Ranch. Her heart raced not from fear of the land, nor from fatigue, but from the anticipation of facing the people who had cast her out, bound and abandoned, the night before. Dakota noticed her unease and said nothing, but his presence was a steady anchor beside her. Every motion he made was deliberate and calm, each movement purposeful. Unlike the chaotic cruelty of her in-laws, Dakota's approach carried certainty, the kind of certainty that inspired confidence. Even when danger was near Dot as they crested a small rise, the ranch came into view. The wooden fence where Rebecca had been tied stood crooked against the morning sun. Her chest tightened. The memory of rough rope biting her wrists returned. The sight of it, still standing, brought a pang of anger that she fought to control. "Stay close," Dakota murmured, his voice low and steady. "Do not speak until you are ready. I will be beside you." They approached the ranch cautiously. The barn doors were closed, but figures moved in the yard. Her in-laws. Their morning routine of chores seemed ordinary, mundane, but Rebecca knew what had transpired. They believed the injustice was hidden, and that she had vanished into the prairie's unforgiving expanse. Dakota dismounted first and offered his hand to Rebecca. She took it, feeling the strength of his grip, a silent promise of protection. Side by side, they walked toward the main house. The sound of their boots on the dry earth caught the attention of the Hales, and they turned abruptly. Shock registered on their faces before anger. A brief flash of disbelief that Rebecca was alive and that she was not alone. Their eyes widened at the sight of Dakota standing tall beside her. His posture radiated authority, his gaze unwavering. No one dared challenge him. Rebecca's voice trembled, but she spoke. "You tied me to a fence last night. You left me to suffer, to die. Everything you blamed on me. It was a lie." Her mother-in-law's mouth opened, then closed. Her father-in-law's hands clenched at his sides. Neither spoke, uncertain how to respond to a woman who had returned with a warrior at her side. Dakota stepped slightly forward, a silent sentinel. "She tells the truth," he said firmly. "Your cruelty is not hidden. Justice will be done." A wagon creaked in the distance as the sheriff arrived, summoned by concerned neighbors who had witnessed the Hales accusations and strange disappearance. The sheriff's presence added weight to the moment, confirming that the law now watched. He listened as Rebecca recounted her ordeal, naming each act of malice and betrayal. The in-laws stammered, attempted excuses, but the truth had taken a form stronger than fear or lies. The sheriff nodded, calling for their arrest. The Hales' power, built on intimidation and secrecy, crumbled in an instant under the light of truth. Rebecca's chest felt lighter as the Hales were led away. The bitterness and terror that had bound her like rope were finally replaced by a clear sense of justice. No longer a victim, she had claimed her voice, her story, and her place in the world. Datia Da stayed by her side through it all, never overbearing, only steady. When the sheriff turned his attention elsewhere, Rebecca looked up at him. I couldn't have faced them alone," she admitted, her voice quiet but certain. "You did not face them alone," he replied. "You faced them with courage and with truth. That is strength." For the first time since the trauma began, Rebecca felt a sense of ownership over her own life. She had been abandoned, betrayed, and hurt, but she had also survived. She had acted, chosen, and reclaimed herself. And she had someone beside her who respected her, who valued her, who believed in her. As the sun climbed higher, Rebecca and Dakota rode away from the ranch together, the wide prairie stretching before them. The day was no longer defined by cruelty or fear, but by possibility and hope. With each step of their horses, the past's weight lightened, and the horizon offered a promise of new beginnings. Rebecca realized that her survival was more than escaping harm, it was learning, growing, and reclaiming her life. And as long as she rode beside Dakota, she knew she would not only survive, but thrive. The frontier could be harsh and unforgiving, but it was also a place of courage, justice, and unexpected kindness, and Rebecca was finally ready to embrace it fully. The prairie stretched endlessly before Rebecca and Dakota, bathed in the soft glow of mid-morning sunlight. The past, the betrayal, the fear, the cruel in-laws felt like a distant shadow, one that no longer held power over her. Yet the memory of that night tied to the fence remained vivid, a reminder of the strength she had discovered within herself and the unexpected kindness of the Apache warrior who had saved her. Dakota led her to a small, well-hidden camp along a gentle creek, where a cluster of other Apache families lived in harmony with the land. Rebecca had been hesitant at first. She knew little of their ways, and settlers often whispered fears about Indians that painted them as dangerous or uncaring. But as she stepped into the community, she felt something entirely different: warmth, respect, and an unspoken understanding that everyone mattered, no matter their past. The days that followed were filled with both hard work and discovery. She learned to draw water from the stream, to light a fire without matches, and to prepare meals with fresh herbs, corn, and game. She learned to track animals, read the weather by the clouds, and listen to the wind as it whispered across the grass. Dakota taught her patiently, never condescending, always encouraging her to trust her instincts and her abilities. Rebecca's hands, once weak from fear and confinement, became capable and strong. Her mind, once clouded with grief and doubt, grew sharp and observant. For the first time in her life, she felt in tune with the land, with its rhythms and its challenges. She understood that survival was more than escaping danger, it was embracing it, learning from it, and becoming part of the world around her, Dakota remained a constant presence, not as a teacher or protector, but as a companion. He shared stories of his people, of their traditions and values, of the lessons the land itself could teach. He never pressured her, never assumed her consent or her thoughts, but always treated her opinions and decisions with respect. As the days turned into weeks, Rebecca realized that she was not just surviving, she was thriving. The pain of her past had not disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. She laughed freely, worked diligently, and even began to anticipate small joys: the first rays of sunlight, the gentle splash of fish in the creek, the quiet companionship of Dakota as they walked together along the prairie. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of orange and pink, Dakota approached her with a serious expression. "Rebecca," he said softly, "you have endured much. You have grown stronger than you know. But life here is not just about survival. It is about choosing what you value, what you protect, and with whom you share your path." Rebecca looked at him, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude, trust, and something deeper she could not yet name. I know I want to stay," she admitted. "I want to continue learning, and I want to be part of this." Dakota's eyes softened. He offered her a hand, steady and patient. "Then walk with me, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose to." Rebecca took his hand. The gesture was simple, yet it held the weight of choice, trust, and mutual respect. She realized that this moment marked not just a new chapter, but a new life. She had reclaimed her agency, her voice, and her destiny. The community welcomed her fully, celebrating her strength and resilience. She learned not just survival skills, but life lessons, respect for others, courage in the face of injustice, and the understanding that compassion could bridge differences that fear or ignorance might otherwise widen. For Rebecca, the prairie had transformed from a place of danger into a place of growth. She had been abandoned, betrayed, and tested, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the life she chose. And through it all, Dakota remained by her side, a partner, a friend, and eventually, something more, a bond forged through respect, courage, and shared experience. As the sun set on another day, painting the sky in fiery hues, Rebecca knew that she was no longer defined by her past. She was defined by her strength, her choices, and the life she was building with Dakota. The frontier was wide and untamed, but she was ready. The prairie had given her a second chance, and she would not waste it. The prairie was quiet, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. A gentle wind rippled through the tall grasses, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. Rebecca stood beside Dakota, watching the horizon stretch endlessly ahead of them. It was a vast, untamed land, a place of challenge, beauty, and freedom. And now it was theirs to share. Since leaving the Hollow Ranch, Rebecca's life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The initial fear and grief that had followed her like shadows had been replaced by confidence, resilience, and purpose. She had learned not just to survive, but to thrive, to take charge of her destiny, and to value herself as much as she valued others. Dakota had been more than a rescuer. He had been a teacher, a guide, and eventually a partner in every sense. He treated her as an equal, listening to her ideas, respecting her decisions, and encouraging her independence. The bond between them had grown slowly, built on trust, shared experiences, and a deep understanding of one another's strengths and vulnerabilities. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, Dakota turned to her, his expression calm but filled with quiet determination. "Rebecca," he said, "we have faced hardship, injustice, and fear, but we have also found strength, courage, and understanding. The land has tested us both, and we have passed that test together. Now it is time to choose our path forward." Rebecca felt a swell of emotion. She thought of the rope that had once bound her, the cruel hands that had tried to control her life, and the hopelessness she had carried through endless nights. All of that was behind her now, replaced by possibility and choice. She nodded, her voice steady. "I choose this life with you and with respect for all that I have learned." Dakota extended his hand to her once more, and this time it was not just a gesture of guidance or protection. It was an invitation to a shared life, a partnership rooted in equality, respect, and mutual care. Rebecca took it, and in that simple act she embraced not just love, but agency, courage, and a future of her own making. Over the following months, Rebecca became fully integrated into Dakota's community. She continued to learn essential skills: tracking, foraging, understanding the signs of weather, and communicating with the land in ways she had never imagined. But she also shared her knowledge, teaching practical skills she had learned from her settler upbringing, helping to bridge the understanding between communities. The bond between Rebecca and Dakota deepened, moving beyond friendship and mentorship into the tender beginnings of love. It was a love built on respect, trust, and shared experience, far different from the power and control that had defined her past relationships. Every glance, every shared task, every quiet moment around the fire reinforced the strength of their connection. One crisp morning, as the sun rose over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Dakota knelt beside her. "Rebecca," he said, his voice gentle but unwavering, "you are no longer a victim of cruelty or fear. You are strong, wise, and courageous. Walk with me as my partner, my equal, and my companion for all the days to come." Rebecca's eyes glistened. She realized that she had arrived at a place she had never thought possible, a life where her voice mattered, her choices were honored, and her past no longer dictated her future. She took Dakota's hand, feeling the warmth of his strength and the steady rhythm of his heart. Together they walked across the prairie, side by side, ready to face whatever the future might bring. The land around them was wide and untamed, but so were they in spirit and courage. And in love, Rebecca had learned important lessons along her journey, that injustice cannot remain hidden, that compassion and courage are the truest forms of strength, and that respect and understanding can bridge divides even in the harshest of places. She had discovered that survival is not merely about escaping danger, but about reclaiming one's agency, embracing knowledge, and building life on principles of fairness and empathy. As the wind whispered across the grasses, Rebecca smiled. For the first time in her life, she felt wholly free. She had been abandoned and betrayed, yet she had emerged stronger, wiser, and capable of creating a future defined by her choices. And now, with Dakota by her side, she knew she would never face the world alone again. The prairie stretched endlessly ahead, a canvas for their shared life, a place of learning, growth, and love. And as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, Rebecca and Dakota walked hand in hand, ready to write the next chapter together, grounded in courage, justice, and the enduring power of hope. The frontier had tested them, but it had also taught them life is not about the hardships endured alone, but about the strength, compassion, and choices that shape the journey forward. And in that, they had found a true happy ending.